Just questioning my orders." That's what Dr. Hargrove said to Captain Whitmore's entire family, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. Katie Morrison stood at the foot of the hospital bed, her hands folded in front of her, and did not flinch. She did not look away. She did not retreat. The family's eyes darted between the doctor and the nurse like spectators at a tennis match they didn't understand, and Katie felt the weight of their confusion settle across the room like dust. Dr. Hargrove's smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that made orderlies find reasons to be elsewhere. A nurse suggesting a dosage correction. As if she'd attended medical school. He turned back to Captain Whitmore with paternal warmth, and just like that, Katie Morrison became invisible again. She walked out of room 347 with measured steps. Not fast. Not slow. The kind of pace that belonged to someone who had learned long ago that running only made predators chase harder. The corridor of Oak Creek Memorial stretched before her like a tunnel, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical drone, and she kept her eyes forward on the supply cart she needed to restock. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like it always did, sharp, chemical, nothing like the copper and dust smell of the Sangin Valley that sometimes woke her at 3 in the morning. She breathed through her nose and kept moving. The break room door swung open and she stepped inside, letting it close behind her with a soft click. The room was small, crowded with a refrigerator that rattled like a failing engine, a microwave that smelled of burned popcorn, and a wall of lockers painted industrial beige. 3 other nurses sat at the small table in the corner, Jennifer from the night shift, Marcus from surgical recovery, and young Davis who'd been at Oak Creek for maybe 6 months. They all looked up when Katie entered. Then they looked away. Deliberately. The kind of a way that meant they'd heard everything. That they knew Dr. Hargrove had made his position crystal clear. Association with Katie Morrison meant scrutiny on their own charts, audits on their procedures, questions about their competence whispered in the right ears. Katie moved to her locker without comment. The metal door was cool under her fingers as she opened it, and there, just visible for a moment before she could push it deeper into the shadows, was the faded unit patch she kept sewn into the lining of her jacket. It wasn't much. Fabric worn thin at the edges, colors faded to something between gray and memory. 20 years old. She closed the locker quickly and pretended to look for her lunch. "I'm heading out," Jennifer said to no one in particular. She stood, gathering her things with exaggerated care. "Early morning tomorrow." Marcus stood. "Yeah, me too." He didn't look at Katie. Davis hesitated for maybe 2 seconds. Katie could feel the young nurse's internal calculation happening in real time, the calculation about whether standing by someone was worth the professional cost. She watched the moment when Davis decided the answer was no. He stood without a word and followed the others out. The door swung shut behind them, and Katie heard Jennifer's voice in the hallway say something about staffing shortages, her tone manufactured bright, the kind of conversation meant to fill the space where actual friendship used to be. Katie sat alone in the break room with her sandwich she didn't want to eat and the knowledge that Dr. Hargrove had been very effective indeed. It wasn't the first time. Oak Creek Memorial operated on a hierarchy as rigid as any military structure, but with less honor. At the top sat physicians like Dr. Hargrove, who had the power to make a nurse's life professionally impossible without ever leaving a mark that a lawyer could see. Below them came the administrators who depended on those physicians for patient volume and hospital prestige. Below that came the nurses, who cleaned up the messes and caught the mistakes and most of whom had learned to keep their mouths shut. Katie had tried keeping hers shut. For 6 months, she had been invisible. She had done her job well enough to draw no attention and poorly enough to raise no questions. She had learned the names of patients' families and forgotten them just as quickly. She had inserted fours without hesitation on the first attempt, adjusted medications with precision, caught early signs of deterioration that newer nurses missed, all without explanation, all without fanfare. Just a nurse. Competent. Quiet. Forgettable. Then she'd seen him in the pharmacy. It was 3 weeks ago. She'd been restocking the 4 cart when she glanced through the window into the medication preparation room. Dr. Hargrove stood alone at one of the computers, his fingers moving across the tablet with the focused intensity of someone doing something he knew was wrong. Katie's eyes caught on the numbers scrolling past: equipment charges inflated by 400%, overflow costs directed to phantom vendors, totals being transferred in regular increments to accounts she knew existed only because she'd heard two hospital administrators whisper about them in the supply closet once. She'd looked away immediately. Quickly. The kind of look away that said she'd seen nothing, knew nothing, would report nothing. But Dr. Hargrove had a gift for reading silence. The first write-up came 5 days later. Unprofessional conduct during patient rounds. It was vague enough to be unfalsifiable. She hadn't done anything unprofessional. She'd stood quietly, taken notes, responded when addressed. But there it was on the unit board, her name under the word insubordination, signed by Dr. Hargrove with a signature that looked like a snake signature might look, all sharp angles and aggressive curves. The second write-up came 4 days after that. Failure to follow protocol in medication administration. Except she had followed protocol. She'd administered the exact dose Dr. Hargrove had ordered, at the exact time he'd specified, with the exact double-check procedure required. But the write-up said she hadn't checked the patient's allergies twice, a fabrication so easy to make it was almost elegant. Who would believe a nurse over a doctor? Today's write-up was the third one, and it sat on the unit board where everyone could see it. Katie stood in front of it now, having returned to the hallway after the break room cleared. The paper was laminated, official, sealed with institutional authority. Insubordination and creating a hostile environment. The date was this morning. The signature was Dr. Hargrove's. The description of her alleged behavior was so thoroughly disconnected from anything she'd actually done that it felt like reading fiction about herself. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. Just one. She wiped it without looking away from the paper, turning her face away from the few nurses passing in the hallway. Her composure didn't crack. Her breathing remained steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 18 years of military service had taught her how to lock down everything: anger, frustration, fear, the weight of knowing she couldn't fight back without losing everything she'd worked 6 months to build in this new life, this anonymous life, this carefully constructed invisibility. She pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the slight weight of her hospital badge, and then she straightened her scrubs. Adjusted the collar. Checked her watch. 2:51 p.m. Captain James Whitmore would need vital signs checked at 3 o'clock. His chart said routine cardiac monitoring, 3 nights of observation before discharge, nothing complicated. He was a kind man with the bearing of someone who'd spent his life serving. He'd thanked her when she adjusted his pillow. He'd asked her name. She'd given it, Katie, just Katie, and he'd smiled like he'd heard something important in the way she'd said it. But he didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. 20 years transforms a 3-year-old child into someone unrecognizable, and she'd been a soldier then, hard and focused and marked by dust and debris. The nurse he saw was someone different entirely, middle-aged, graying at the temples, marked now by 20 years of trying to forget Sangin. She turned away from the write-up and walked back toward the patient rooms. Her hands were steady as she pushed the vital signs cart. Her face was composed. Dr. Hargrove passed her in the hallway and didn't spare her a glance. She was already below his notice, already becoming the kind of problem that would solve itself through institutional pressure. He had no idea that the woman he was systematically destroying had once been legendary in a hospital in Kandahar. He had no idea that the hands pushing that vital signs cart had performed emergency procedures under mortar fire, that had held a Marine's artery closed with nothing but bare fingers and will for 40 minutes until the medevac landed. He had no idea that the quiet nurse he was orchestrating to destroy had once pulled 11 soldiers out of a kill zone while the dust still fell like snow. The room 347 door was open. Captain Whitmore looked up from the television he wasn't really watching and smiled. "Vital signs check," Katie said, her voice level, professional, empty of everything except what was necessary. He nodded and extended his arm for the blood pressure cuff. She wrapped it with practiced efficiency, feeling his pulse beneath her fingers, steady, regular, strong. 120 beats per minute. Everything normal. Everything stable. He watched her face while she worked, and for a moment she wondered if he saw something familiar there, some echo of a woman who'd pulled him from rubble when he was 3 years old. She waited for recognition. It didn't come. "You're good at this," he said as she removed the cuff. "Most nurses fumble around. You're like," he paused, searching for words. "Like someone who's done this 1,000 times before." Katie didn't answer. She recorded his vitals in his chart with neat, precise handwriting and turned toward the door. "Thank you," Captain Whitmore said. She paused. Just for a moment. Just long enough that if he'd been watching closely, he might have noticed that something moved behind her eyes, a flicker of something old and heavy and kept locked down for 2 decades. Then she nodded and stepped back into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her. And that's when the real nightmare began. Katie Morrison checked Captain Whitmore's vitals at 0600 the next morning with the same clinical precision she'd maintained for 6 months at Oak Creek Memorial, blood pressure 138/88, slightly elevated but within acceptable parameters for a recovering cardiac patient. His color was good. His oxygen saturation holding steady at 97% on room air. He smiled when she entered, thanked her again for the thorough checks the previous evening, mentioned he'd be discharged tomorrow and returning to the USS Halsey. She nodded, documented everything in his chart, and felt the familiar weight of silence settle across her chest, the weight of knowing someone so completely while remaining entirely unknown to them. At 0830, Dr. Hargrove swept into the room with 2 residents trailing like satellites in his orbit. He glanced at Katie's shift notes, the ones where she documented Captain Whitmore's stable condition and her recommendation for maintaining the current anticoagulant regimen. Without reading them fully, Hargrove announced he was changing the medication, increasing the dosage by 40%, switching to a more aggressive protocol. Katie felt the words form in her throat, the clinical objection already shaping itself. The interaction with Whitmore's beta blocker could cause severe bradycardia, possibly complete heart block. She'd seen it happen in the military hospital at Bagram when a surgeon ordered an incompatible drug combination. The patient coded. They brought him back, barely. She met Hargrove's eyes. He was watching her, waiting, almost hoping she would speak. His fingers tapped against his stethoscope like a predator drumming claws on stone. Katie closed her mouth. She'd learned in 6 months what it took some nurses years to understand. Challenging Hargrove in front of an audience only gave him ammunition. She documented his order without comment, watched him leave with his entourage, and felt the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining seem to burn against her ribs, a silent accusation from a version of herself who would never have stayed quiet. At 10:30, the break room humiliation crystallized into something sharper and more calculated. Katie entered to find 6 nurses gathered around the table, Linda from day shift, Marcus from nights, Sarah, Jennifer, 2 others whose names she'd learned but whose conversation stopped the moment she appeared. The talking died like a radio station losing signal. Linda gathered her sandwich without making eye contact. Marcus closed his laptop with deliberate slowness. One by one, they filed past her toward the door, their shoulders angled slightly away as though association alone might be contagious. Through the window above the sink, Katie watched them reconvene in the hallway. She caught fragments, Hargrove's voice, smooth and damning. The association with Nurse Morrison means audit scrutiny, schedule complications, potential questions about your own clinical judgment. She'd become radioactive. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she'd seen something Hargrove wanted buried, and he was a man who understood institutional leverage the way a chess master understands squares and sacrifices. The fluorescent light above the microwave flickered, a sound like insects caught in plastic, urgent and repetitive. Katie's microwaved soup sat cooling on the counter, steam rising in thin strands that caught the sick fluorescent glow. She didn't eat. She sat alone for 17 minutes, her hand steady around the bowl, her breathing controlled. This was stage 3 of Hargrove's escalation, social isolation weaponized through fear. The other nurses weren't being cruel. They were being practical. And that somehow hurt worse. By 1100, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board where all staff gathered for shift assignments. Katie saw it printed on official hospital letterhead, the words precise and carefully constructed, Nurse K. Morrison, insubordination, creating hostile work environment, repeated challenges to physician authority, undermining chain of command. It was the third fabricated infraction in 14 days. Hargrove was building a termination case the way a prosecutor builds a criminal file, layering small documented incidents into an overwhelming pattern. The first write-up had cited her for questioning medication protocols. The second for making suggestions during patient rounds. This third one was vaguer, more dangerous, environmental toxicity. Subjective. Unfalsifiable. Perfect. 12 staff members stood within sight of the board. Katie read the document while they pretended to check their phones or study the assignment schedule. A single tear escaped, not from shame, from something colder and more dangerous, clarity. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with the page, and something in her face must have shifted because even at 43 years old, with grey threading through her hair and scars on her hands that told stories only she remembered, people instinctively moved away. Hargrove materialized beside her 2 minutes later, coffee in hand, his smile the kind that predators wear just before they strike. Some people just aren't cut out for team environments, Nurse Morrison. His voice carried far enough for everyone to hear. Perhaps it's time to consider a career change. Home health, maybe. You could work alone. Wouldn't have to worry about team dynamics. Katie turned to face him fully. Her voice, when it came, was steady and low, the voice of someone who had already survived worse than this. The truth has a way of surfacing, Doctor, no matter how deep you bury it. His smile faltered. Not much. Just enough for her to see it. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator with the artificial confidence of a man whose certainty had been momentarily shaken. That afternoon, she watched him in urgent conversation with 2 board members near the stairwell, all 3 of them glancing in her direction with the practiced discretion of people discussing someone's career termination. The next morning arrived with the deceptive calm of a hospital's quietest hours. Katie checked Captain Whitmore's vitals at 0600, her hands moving through the routine with unconscious precision, blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, temperature. Everything acceptable. Everything within range. He thanked her again, mentioned he was being discharged today, talked about his service aboard the USS Halsey and the crews he'd served with. She listened and nodded and documented everything, and didn't tell him that she'd once held a tourniquet on a Marine's leg in a place called Sangin while mortars turned the sky orange and a 3-year-old boy screamed in Pashto until her ears rang. At 0830, something changed. Captain Whitmore called for assistance, his voice carrying an edge of something that wasn't quite fear but was definitely not comfort. Katie found him sitting upright in bed, his chest rising and falling with the strained quality of someone breathing through liquid. His face had gone the color of old paper. His jugular veins were distended, visibly swollen with blood backing up into the superior vena cava. She checked his vitals and felt the data reorder everything, blood pressure 92/54 and dropping. Heart rate 118, climbing. Oxygen saturation still holding but his work of breathing was increasing. Muffled heart sounds. All of it clicking into place with the terrible clarity of pattern recognition honed through combat, cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart, preventing it from filling properly. Katie had seen it exactly twice before, once in Ramadi when an insurgent's mortar round caught a corpsman in the left chest wall, and once in Sangin when a sergeant took shrapnel during a compound assault. She knew the timeline. She knew what was coming. 3 minutes until loss of consciousness. Maybe 6 before irreversible damage. Maybe longer if the fluid accumulated slowly. Maybe much shorter if it didn't. She hit the code button and the alarm became a second heartbeat, urgent and authoritative. The crash cart was 40 feet away. She was moving before her conscious mind finished calculating trajectories. Her hands knew what to do. Her hands had done this before, not with antiseptic and proper equipment, but with whatever was available in the wreckage of a bombed compound while rounds snapped overhead like angry hornets. Dr. Hargrove arrived 90 seconds later, which was somehow both faster and too slow. He fumbled with his stethoscope, his hands betraying the fact that this wasn't his skill set. "Get me a portable ultrasound," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of institutional rank but not competence. "We need imaging. Could be pericarditis, could be a retained tamponade from the original admission. Let's get a chest CT." Katie was already moving, 14-gauge angiocath needle, sterile drape, chlorhexidine for the skin. Everything arranged on the crash cart like an old prayer, muscle memory speaking louder than confusion. "Cardiac tamponade," she said, her voice carrying no inflection, only data. Distended jugulars, muffled heart sounds, hypertension completing Beck's triad. "He's decompensating. Pericardiocentesis now. CT can wait if he arrests." "That's not your call, Nurse Morrison." Hargrove's face had taken on the quality of a man who was losing control of a situation he'd never actually controlled. "We follow protocol. Imaging first, then." Katie wasn't listening anymore. She was prepping the skin over the fifth intercostal space, just lateral to the midsternal line, finding the angle by feel and intuition and the memory of doing this in a helicopter once, landing zone hot, a Marine's chest cavity open to the world. Captain Whitmore's breath came in short gasps. His eyes had started to unfocus. She inserted the needle and felt the familiar give as the pericardium yielded. The syringe filled immediately, blood, dark and urgent. 60 cubic centimeters in the first drawer. Another 40 in the second. The heart sounds returned within seconds. The blood pressure climbed, 94, 98, 102. Captain Whitmore's color shifted from paperwhite to something closer to human again. 90 seconds. That's all it took to save his life. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that comes from watching someone move with absolute certainty, the kind of silence that precedes understanding. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen, his stethoscope hanging useless around his neck like a symbolic failure. The resident stared. Whitmore, breathing easier now, looked at Katie with something like recognition beginning to move across his features, but not yet crystallized. Not yet understanding that the tired nurse in the faded scrubs had just done something that belonged to a different life entirely. Katie disposed of the needle, documented the fluid withdrawal, checked Whitmore's vitals one more time. Everything stable. Everything responding. Everything exactly as it should be in the aftermath of an emergency she shouldn't have known how to handle, performed with hands she shouldn't have still possessed after 20 years of pretending to be someone ordinary. She turned to face Dr. Hargrove, and when she spoke, her voice had shifted into a register lower than she'd used in months, the voice of someone who'd stopped performing. "We'll need cardiology on consult. And interventional radiology if there's any reaccumulation." She paused. It wasn't protocol. It was medicine. Then she walked from the room before he could respond, before anyone could ask questions, before Captain Whitmore's recognition could fully blossom into the terrible understanding that the woman he'd just watched work was something far more than a night shift nurse in a Norfolk hospital. But that wasn't the worst part. Within the hour, Hargrove's office became a war room. Katie watched through the glass partition as he paced, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand stabbing the air like he was conducting an orchestra of destruction. She was still in uniform, still in scrubs, still in the hospital, but something had already shifted. The air around her felt different, charged, like the moment before an IED detonation when every nerve in your body screams that the ground beneath your feet isn't safe anymore. "Board members need to know about this," Hargrove was saying, his voice carrying through the partition's thin walls. A nurse acting without authorization. Performing procedures beyond her scope. She could have killed him. The lie came so smoothly it was almost artistic. Katie had just saved that man's life, and Hargrove was already rewriting the narrative like a propagandist with a pen. Yes. Yes, I understand the liability. We need to move fast." She didn't flinch. Didn't look at him. Instead, she walked to the supply room and began the ritual of documenting what she'd done, the time of intervention, the vital signs, the 60 cubic centimeters of blood she'd aspirated from around Whitmore's heart. Her handwriting was steady, each letter precise, military training overriding the adrenaline still flooding her system. The pericardiocentesis kit lay on the counter, its packaging shredded, the needle sheath resting beside it like spent shell casing. She'd done the procedure exactly as she'd been trained to do it, under fire, under pressure, with a patient's life measured in seconds. The only difference was the uniform she wore had a hospital logo instead of a Navy insignia. Hargrove hung up and immediately dialed again. Katie could hear the tone shift in his voice, more deferential now, speaking to someone with actual authority. "Yes, Dr. Sterling. I'm calling about a serious incident with one of our nursing staff. Katie Morrison." "Yes, that name. She's created a hostile work environment for months, and today she overstepped drastically during an emergency." Katie's jaw tightened, but only fractionally. That was the telltale sign of restraint, not a tremor, not a crack in her voice, just a microscopic clench of muscle that most people wouldn't notice. She was a vault, and the key had been thrown into the deepest part of the ocean 20 years ago in Sangin. By 1430, the investigators showed up. Not hospital security, actual outside investigators, the kind that meant Hargrove had connections deeper than the medical staff directory. They had folders with Katie's name on them, and they asked questions about her previous employment with a precision that told her they'd already made calls. To hospitals that didn't exist. To supervisors she'd never met. To references that had never heard her name. "You worked at Mercy General in Seattle," one of them asked, a woman with a scanner face and grey suit that cost more than Katie's monthly rent. "No," Katie said simply. She was sitting in the HR office now, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. The sound was getting to her, that constant electrical hum that never stopped, never paused, just droned on like machinery counting down to something inevitable. "But our records show." "Your records are wrong." Katie's voice was level, factual, the tone of someone stating the simple truth. "I've been at Oak Creek for 6 months. Before that, I was." She paused. Not a hesitation. A choice. Taking care of family. The investigator's partner leaned forward, a man with eyes like shark's eyes, predatory and utterly without empathy. "Previous employers seem to have no record of you. That's unusual. People don't always keep records they should." Katie's hands rested on the table, palms down. Visible. Non-threatening. She'd learned how to make herself appear harmless a long time ago, usually when it mattered most. "Check again. You might find things are missing." What they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that Hargrove was 3 steps ahead of them. He'd already been making calls before the pericardiocentesis was even complete, before the ambulance could have been summoned. He'd been constructing an alternate reality where Katie Morrison was a mentally unstable nurse with a history of boundary violations and fabricated credentials. By the time the investigators called those fake references, they would find nothing because there was nothing to find. By the time they tried to verify her background, the holes would be exactly what Hargrove had prepared them to be. An emergency disciplinary hearing was convened for 1800. Katie received notice at 1745, printed on hospital letterhead with her name at the top like a death warrant. In response to today's incident involving unauthorized medical intervention and breach of protocol, it read. The word swam on the page, not because her vision was failing, but because she understood exactly what they meant. Hargrove had turned the one thing she'd done right into evidence of instability. He'd weaponized her competence against her. She was allowed to attend the hearing in the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor. Allowed was the wrong word. Ordered. Required. Escorted by a security guard who didn't meet her eyes, a young man, probably fresh out of his certification, probably had no idea that the woman beside him had held more lives together than he'd ever see in his career. Hargrove sat across the table with the hospital's chief of medicine and the HR director. He had a binder of documentation, all of it fabricated, all of it bearing dates that predated her employment. Complaints from nurses who'd never made complaints. Incident reports from weeks when Katie had been working perfectly legally, saving lives, keeping her head down. His testimony came out smooth as river stones, carefully arranged, devastating in its specificity. Pattern of erratic behavior, he said. Psychological instability. A nurse who believes she knows better than physicians. Today was simply the culmination of months of concerning behavior. Katie sat in silence. She didn't defend herself. Didn't interrupt. Didn't explain that the procedure she'd performed was textbook, that her hands had been steadier than they'd been in 20 years, that Captain Whitmore was alive because she'd acted while Hargrove froze. The evidence against her was airtight, built on nothing but air, shaped by a man who'd been practicing deception for so long it looked like truth. The chief of medicine didn't make eye contact either. He was afraid of Hargrove, Katie realized. Afraid of what associations might be used against him if he defended her. Fear was a powerful motivator, more reliable than loyalty, more efficient than justice. Ms. Morrison, the HR director, said carefully, based on Dr. Hargrove's testimony and the documentation presented, we have no choice but to recommend immediate suspension pending a full investigation. You'll need to surrender your hospital badge, Anne. I understand. Katie's voice was quiet. Not weak. Quiet the way a predator was quiet, not making a sound until the moment to strike arrived. Security escorted her from the building at 1920. She walked through the staff corridors one last time, past the break room where other nurses suddenly found reasons to look away, past the emergency department where Captain Whitmore was being admitted to cardiac care, alive, stable, monitored. She could have gone to him. Could have explained. Could have told him the truth about who she was. Instead, she kept walking. Her locker was sealed. Her personal items would be boxed up and held in HR for 30 days. Her badge, the only thing that had given her temporary legitimacy in the civilian world, was confiscated by a security guard whose hands trembled slightly as he took it from her. I'm sorry, he said quietly, and Katie knew he meant it. He was just following orders. She didn't respond. Just walked past him toward the employee exit, her scrub still damp with Whitmore's blood, her hand still holding the muscle memory of saving a life that no one would acknowledge she'd saved. The Norfolk VA hospital sat on Colley Avenue like a monument to forgotten people, and Katie became one of them that night. She sat in the waiting room at 2140, surrounded by veterans in wheelchairs and prosthetics, men and women she'd once treated as Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison, now watching her fill out intake forms as just another PTSD patient who couldn't outrun her ghosts. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. A television in the corner played news about political scandals and weather systems moving slowly across the country. An old man in a wheelchair coughed into a tissue. A woman missing her left leg stared at nothing. Katie's appointment card trembled in her hands, not from fear, but from the restraint required to keep her rage contained. She was sitting next to her own history, surrounded by people who'd served under different commands, in different years, in different wars. They didn't recognize her. 20 years, one different uniform, and a whole different life had erased Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison from their memory. The intake nurse asked her name. Katie, she said. Just Katie. Not Morrison. Not Senior Chief. Just a woman in scrubs trying to figure out how to breathe when breathing meant remembering Sangin and Hargrove and the moment when her hands remembered exactly what they'd been trained to do. And what brings you in tonight? The intake nurse asked, her voice kind, professional, practiced. Katie thought about answering. Thought about explaining how a man had tried to destroy her for saving another man's life. Thought about how she'd spent 20 years running from the thing she was best at, only to have it betray her the moment she used it. Thought about the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only piece of her past she'd kept hidden, burning against her ribs like a brand mark. PTSD, Katie said simply. Combat-related. The intake nurse nodded, made notes, and Katie understood that she'd just become a statistic instead of a person. Which meant, in the VA system, she'd finally be safe. The security guard walked 3 steps ahead, his key card ready for the locker room access. Katie followed in her scrubs, the fabric still smelling faintly of antiseptic and something else, the particular staleness of a uniform worn through fear. The corridor at 7:44 a.m. on a Wednesday was quieter than usual. Most of the night shift had clocked out. The day shift was still assembling in break rooms across the hospital, loading coffee into thermoses, pretending the work ahead was manageable. She didn't belong to either group anymore. Her locker was in the back corner of the break room, next to the supply cabinet where she'd found Dr. Hargrove altering those billing codes for weeks ago. The moment that had ended everything. The security guard stood by the door, checking his phone. Katie opened the locker and stared at the contents: a change of clothes, 2 protein bars, a photograph of her sister in a frame, and the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining. That faded patch was all that remained of Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison. Everything else had been systematically erased. She reached for the photograph first. That was when the boots began. Not the soft-soled shoes of hospital staff. Tactical boots. The kind that move with purpose down tile hallways. Multiple pairs. Katie froze, her hand still gripping the frame. The security guard's posture changed. He straightened, shifted his weight. His radio crackled. Code blue, Trauma Bay 4. Standard hospital noise. But the boots kept coming, and they weren't heading to Trauma Bay 4. They were heading to this unit. Katie could track the footsteps by sound alone. 4 soldiers moving in formation. 2 breaking off toward what sounded like the ICU wing. 2 continuing toward the patient rooms. The security guard stepped into the hallway to look, and Katie heard him breathe out slowly. "You might want to stay in here for a minute." She didn't ask why. She moved instead to the break room doorway and looked down the corridor. Captain Whitmore's room was surrounded by naval officers in dress uniforms, at least 6 of them, maybe more in the room itself. The officers' uniforms meant something: the sleeve insignia, the medals, the bearing that came from command authority. Through the open door, she could see the detail had tripled outside the Federal Protection Detail guarding Khalid Raisin's room. For U.S. Marshals and 2 men in dark suits who moved with the particular quietness of federal agents. Khalid himself was being wheeled past on a gurney for transport, still recovering from his gunshot wound, but conscious now. Fully conscious. His eyes swept the hallway. They locked onto Katie's face. Something shifted in his expression: recognition, but more than that. Memory. The kind of memory that lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the place where survival instinct lives. He began shouting in Pashto, the words tumbling out with the urgency of someone speaking a truth he'd been carrying for 20 years, the angel of Sangin. The woman who stopped the bleeding. The American medic who pulled me from the stones. The hallway froze. Every officer turned. Every nurse stopped moving. The ventilator from the nearest room suddenly sounded impossibly loud, mechanical breathing in the absolute silence. A Navy investigator in civilian clothes stepped forward from the crowd, his eyes moving from Cully to Katie with the swift reassessment of someone seeing evidence materialize in front of him. He was tall, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in offices that required clearances to enter. Captain Whitmore emerged from his room wearing dress blues, not the casual hospital visitor Katie had saved. Not the patient. This was Whitmore in his formal authority, the way he looked in the official Navy photographs Katie had found on the hospital system when she was researching his background. His face shifted through confusion to recognition to something that looked like awe. Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison. The name landed like a defibrillator paddle. Katie's hands began to tremble. Not from fear. From the muscle memory of hands that had held other people together for so long that trembling felt like failure. The investigator moved closer and extended a file folder, her own service record, complete with a photograph from 20 years ago. The face was younger. The eyes hadn't yet learned how to look at things without flinching. But it was unmistakable. She opened the file. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Each citation on its own page, each one describing moments she'd spent 20 years trying not to remember. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal with Valor. The words blurred. She could read them individually but not together. Her brain was processing them the way it processed the smell of diesel fuel and dust, as sensory data that didn't translate to language. A commander stepped forward. Seal trident on his chest, grey at his temples, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His voice was quiet but carried down the hallway with the weight of command authority. Senior Chief Katie Morrison pulled 11 men out of a kill zone in Sangin under sustained fire in 2004. She performed battlefield amputations with a Ka-bar knife when her surgical tools were destroyed by shrapnel. She held a Marine's severed brachial artery closed with her bare hand for 40 minutes until the medevac arrived because the clamps were gone and he would have bled out in 3 minutes without her hands maintaining pressure. He paused. That Marine is alive today because of her. He's got kids now. Grandchildren. Staff members had gathered now. Nurses and doctors filling the hallway like a court convening. The commander continued, she has more combat decorations than most officers will ever see. She was recommended for the Navy Cross, but they downgraded it because she broke protocol by leaving her position to rescue wounded soldiers. She prioritized lives over regulations. That's who saved Captain Whitmore yesterday. Captain Whitmore stepped forward, his voice thick with something, gratitude, shock, recognition. I was 3 years old when our compound was hit by a drone strike meant for insurgents. Senior Chief Morrison dug for 6 hours to pull me out of the rubble. She kept me alive on a helicopter with a collapsed lung using only a ballpoint pen and part of her own intubation tube because that's all we had. I've spent 24 years as a Navy officer trying to honor what she did for me as a child. Khalid was shouting again, this time in fractured English, she saved Taliban fighters too. She made her men treat us the same. I was 17 years old, I hated Americans with everything I had, but she stopped my bleeding like I was her own soldier. His voice cracked. She saved us. The hallway had gone so quiet you could hear the rain outside, drumming against the windows like applause. Katie stood perfectly still, the file folder trembling in her hands, not from fear, but from the trembling of someone who'd spent so long invisible that visibility felt like a threat. An FBI agent stepped forward before Dr. Hargrove could retreat to his office. Katie saw him now, standing at the edge of the crowd, his face draining of color like someone watching his entire world collapse in fast forward. The FBI agent's voice was formal and loud enough that everyone heard it as a statement, not a question. Dr. Richard Hargrove, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and attempted falsification of federal employment records. 2 more agents moved through the crowd with the particular efficiency of federal law enforcement. They flanked Hargrove, who stammered, this is absurd, I don't know what. The FBI agent cut him off, his voice flat, last night you attempted to forge Senior Chief Morrison's military service records to support your termination claims. What you didn't know is that those records are federal documents, and this bureau has been monitoring your computer access for 18 months as part of an investigation into your billing fraud scheme. The hospital administrator's network was also compromised. You made approximately $847,000 in unauthorized equipment charges split with your medical supply contractor. The handcuffs clicked with a sound that echoed down the hallway like a period at the end of a sentence. Dr. Hargrove's face went white. I want my attorney. You'll have one, the agent said. You're going to need several. He read Hargrove his Miranda rights while the officers led him toward the elevator. As they passed the nurse's station, the hallway stayed silent. Not a single person looked away. Not one nurse looked down at their chart. They watched him go with the particular satisfaction of people who'd been waiting to see if accountability actually existed, and finding out that it did. Katie stood in the center of the hallway holding her service record, surrounded by naval officers and FBI agents and the staff of Oak Creek Memorial Hospital. Captain Whitmore approached, his movements formal but his eyes soft. Welcome back, Senior Chief. She didn't know how to respond to that. She'd spent so long being someone else, someone smaller, someone contained, someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. The skill that had kept her alive in combat was the same skill that had almost erased her entirely. Her voice, when it came, was steady, I need some jello. 3 people laughed. The sound broke the tension. The investigator smiled, a real smile, not an official one. "Senior Chief, we need to talk about what happened yesterday. What you did with Captain Whitmore is textbook military medicine. You didn't break any law. You broke a hospital protocol. And you saved a Navy officer's life." Katie looked at the file in her hands. At her own face looking back at her from a photograph taken in a life she'd deliberately left behind. At the medals and citations and the official record of every moment she'd tried to forget. At Captain Whitmore standing in front of her in his dress blues, the 3-year-old boy she'd pulled from rubble now standing as a decorated military officer, alive because her hands had known what to do when everything else failed. "I was trying to disappear," she said. "You did," the SEAL commander said. "But some people don't disappear completely. Some people burn so bright that even when they try to hide, the light finds people in the dark. That's what you did yesterday. That's what you've been doing every shift for 6 months. Saving people with hands that know how." The FBI agent handed her a card. "When this investigation clears, and it will, Senior Chief, the hospital will want you back. They'll offer you a lot more than the position you had. You should consider it. Or you could do other things. Better things." Katie looked at the card, then at Captain Whitmore, then at the space where Dr. Hargrove had stood a moment before. The faded unit patch under her jacket no longer burned. It felt like it had finally come home. The perp walk happened at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 48 hours after Katie Morrison had saved Captain James Whitmore's life with nothing but steady hands and combat muscle memory. FBI agents in dark windbreakers flanked Dr. Hargrove as he was escorted from the detention holding area through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial, the same corridors where he'd reigned like a tyrant for 12 years, where his voice had made junior residents flinch and nurses arrange their schedules around his moods. The hallway fell silent. Not the comfortable quiet of a well-run hospital. This was a vacuum silence, the kind that happens when a predator gets caught in its own trap. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old bone. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and he moved with the careful, shameful shuffle of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. They walked past the nurse's station where Linda Chen stood with both hands over her mouth, her face gone pale as she finally understood what she'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. Linda had whispered good luck to Dr. Hargrove 5 days ago when the fraud investigation was already underway. She'd picked him for the disciplinary board yesterday, voted to fire Katie without hearing a single piece of the truth. Now Linda watched him pass, and Katie saw something break behind her eyes. Marcus, one of the senior nurses who'd turned away from Katie in the break room, stared with wide eyes that had started to understand how badly he'd misjudged everything. The residents who'd been mentored by Hargrove, who'd laughed at his cruel jokes about the unstable nurse with the haunted eyes, looked at the floor. None of them could meet his gaze. The automatic doors of the lobby opened to reveal morning light and 3 news vans already setting up. Someone had tipped the media. The FBI agent later admitted it was a tactical choice, a message sent through cameras and live feeds that fraud in medicine wasn't a quiet problem that got swept away. Hargrove blinked at the flashes like a man surfacing from underwater. The agent walking beside him didn't slow down. Her badge read Special Agent Rivera, and she spoke with the flat, specific tone of someone reading a conviction into existence. "We have documented evidence of 847 instances of billing fraud over 3 years, totaling $2.3 million in fraudulent charges split with your medical supply contractor, who is being arrested this morning in Baltimore." Her voice carried down the hallway without needing to raise. "We have the altered billing codes. We have the kickback payments to your offshore account at HSBC Cayman. And as of last night, we have your attempt to access and modify federal military personnel records to frame Senior Chief Morrison." Hargrove tried once more, his voice cracking like old leather. She was unstable. She was a liability. "I was protecting my patients." "You were protecting your profit margin," Rivera said. Her tone didn't shift. It was like listening to a stone slab slide across concrete. "You saved Captain Whitmore's life while you were preparing to order unnecessary scans that would have killed him and generated $45,000 in fraudulent billing. Your malpractice insurance has been notified. They are already preparing to sue you for gross negligence and fraud. The Department of Justice will be filing additional charges related to healthcare fraud under the False Claims Act. Your career isn't just over, Dr. Hargrove. It's over in ways you haven't even thought about yet. The doors closed behind them. The lobby exhaled. Back inside, in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3, Hospital Administrator Patricia Lowell approached Katie with visible discomfort written across her face like a scar. Lowell had voted to fire her yesterday. Lowell had listened to Hargrove's fabricated testimony without question and nodded along with the other board members. Now she stood in front of the woman she'd helped destroy, and the asymmetry of power had inverted completely. Katie watched her come with the kind of patient attention she'd once reserved for incoming trauma patients, clinical, present, but not engaged. Senior Chief Morrison, Lowell began, and hearing that rank spoken aloud seemed to startle her. I want to offer you immediate reinstatement. Full back pay. 2.4 months of salary. We will formally apologize, both privately and in writing. All disciplinary records will be sealed and expunged. Your position will be restored at whatever level you choose, floor nursing, charge nurse, or management track if you're interested. Lowell's voice had the careful, measured quality of someone reading from a script she'd memorized that morning. We're prepared to make this right. Katie listened without interruption. Her hands were at her sides. Her face remained exactly as it had been during every moment of humiliation, composed, present, untouched by the chaos swirling around her. When Lowell finished, Katie simply nodded. I'll need to think about it, she said. Her voice hadn't changed octave. She hadn't sounded grateful or angry or relieved. She sounded like someone considering a menu option. The SEAL team commander who'd testified to her service record pulled her aside into the stairwell, a man built like a diesel engine, with the kind of scarred knuckles that came from decades of controlled violence. His name was Clayton Graves, and he'd served with her in Sangin during the worst of it. Naval Medical Command has been looking for experienced combat medics to train the next generation, he said, his voice the color of whiskey and tobacco. They want you back. Full rank restoration. Teaching position at Bethesda. Flight surgeon equivalent pay. You'd be training the corpsmen who deploy, teaching them battlefield medicine with someone who's actually lived it. He paused. Senior Chief, you've been running for 20 years. You don't have to run anymore. Katie felt something in her chest shift. Not break. Shift. Like tectonic plates realigning after a long tremor. I need to think about that too, she said. Khalid Raisin was being wheeled back to his room by an orderly when he asked through his hospital translator if he could speak to her. Katie approached his bed, this man who'd once been Taliban, who'd recognized her in the hallway and shouted her name in Pashto like it was a prayer. His dark eyes were clearer now, post-operative lucidity setting in. Through the translator, his Pashto became English. 20 years I think about the American woman with sad eyes who treated the enemy like human being. I testify in trial because of you. You showed me different way. He paused. His hands trembled slightly. Thank you for saving me. Then and now. Katie reached out and squeezed his shoulder. No words. Her grip conveyed more than language could have: recognition, survival, the kind of understanding that only comes from being saved by someone willing to die for you. Captain Whitmore waited until the crowd dispersed before he approached. He moved with the careful precision of someone still healing, his breathing controlled, his movements economical. When he reached her, he didn't extend his hand. He simply stood beside her, looking out the window at the morning light breaking across the Norfolk harbor. I don't remember your face from when I was 3, he said quietly. The memories are too old. Too distorted by 20 years of growing up. But I remember hands that were gentle when everything else was pain. Yesterday those same hands saved my life again. That's the only thing I need to know. Katie felt something break open inside her, not with tears, but with a sound like laughter, exhausted and overwhelming. The faded unit patch inside her jacket didn't burn anymore. It felt like gravity had finally released it, like the weight she'd carried through 2 decades of hiding had finally found a place to rest. The screams from Sangin, the ones that had chased her through every night for 20 years, they weren't gone yet. But they were quieter now. Distant. Like sirens fading in the distance instead of closing in. The reinstatement ceremony happened 2 weeks later, not in a break room but in the hospital's main auditorium, with Captain Whitmore presenting her with a letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Navy. The staff who had avoided her in the break room, who had whispered behind her back, who had accepted Hargrove's lies without question, they applauded. Katie acknowledged them with a slight nod but no smile. Forgiveness would take longer. That was fine. Some things shouldn't be rushed. She had already accepted the teaching position at Bethesda Naval Medical Center, returning to the Navy not as the haunted senior chief petty officer who had fled from screams but as someone who'd learned that running from ghosts only made them follow faster. Her therapist at the VA had suggested that teaching young medics, giving them the skills she'd learned in Blood and Fire, might be the bridge between who she'd been and who she was becoming. That made sense. That felt like forward motion. The detail about Dr. Hargrove's sentence came in a single newspaper paragraph Katie read over coffee on a Tuesday morning: 18-month federal sentence, permanent loss of medical license, $2.3 million in restitution ordered, and afterward, the detail that made her smile: teaching CPR at a community college for minimum wage. The same wages he'd once paid his custodial staff. The same institution where his students wouldn't know his name, would never tremble at his voice, would never restructure their lives around his presence. His punishment wasn't prison. It was anonymity. On her first day teaching at Bethesda, a classroom of 20 young Navy corpsmen stood at attention. Katie stood at the front of the room, wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 2 decades, the rank insignia of Senior Chief Petty Officer sewn into place. The faded unit patch was no longer hidden inside her jacket lining. It hung framed on her office wall, next to her bronze stars and a photograph of her old unit, the men and women who'd trained her for this moment without ever knowing this moment was coming. She began with the words that had lived in her chest since the day she'd stopped running: sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The screams from Sangin had finally gone quiet, replaced by something that sounded almost like peace. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever had to prove yourself in the face of corruption and injustice, subscribe now. Hit that like button and comment below. Would you have spoken up, knowing it might cost you everything? Let's talk about what real courage looks like and why it so often wears scrubs instead of stars.